All right, thank you so much. Welcome to another episode of the Love, Hope, Lyme podcast. My name is Fred Diamond. I'm the author of Love, Hope, Lyme, what family members, partners, and friends who love a chronic Lyme survivor need to know. And at Mary Lyn, we've done over 50 Love, Hope, Lyme podcasts. I want to let people know that this show is not a replacement for medical treatment. So we're making that disclaimer up front. If you're struggling with anything related to Lyme or the co-infections, I strongly encourage that you seek proper medical treatment. The show is up on Apple Podcasts. So if you're a subscriber on Apple Podcasts, thank you so much. Give us a 5-star review. We would greatly appreciate that. If you're watching on YouTube, as many of you do, please give us a thumbs up, ask a question, leave a comment. We get plenty of those, Mary Lyn. We've had some shows where we've had as many as 30, 40 comments. So I appreciate people who are watching the show today. Once again, Love, Hope, Lyme is available on Amazon. Feel free to get it. If you'd like some signed copies, reach out to me via Facebook or LinkedIn. I want to remind people again, the PDF, the electronic version of the book, has been available, Mary Lyn, since day one. Reach out to me via social media if you're a chronic Lyme survivor. Would love to get that to you as well. And I'm excited for today's show. I'm talking with another author who wrote a fantastic book. It's Mary Lyn Hammer, and her book is called Over My Dead Body. And Mary Lyn, we're going to talk about your story in a second here, but the theme of today's show is the whole concept of being a medical detective. And many people listening to today's show or watching on YouTube can relate to what we're going to be talking about. Lyme is a challenging disease to treat, which we're going to be talking about, not just the Lyme, but also the multiple co-infections, your genetic makeup, a lot of your history, age, genes, geography in some cases, things like that. And people have had to figure out for themselves, how to treat themselves. And every body is different. They say, only you know your body. So, and one of the challenges too, which we talk about, is uh, not every doctor knows how to treat Lyme. And there's a lot of different philosophies on Eastern medicine, Western medicine, antibiotics, herbals, other things that people have gone to extremes to use. So it's great to see it. Congratulations on the book. Congratulations on your journey. And we're going to be talking about some of the things that you've discovered along the way that a lot of our listeners can relate to. So, first off, give us an introduction. Tell us whatever it is you want to tell us about your Lyme journey and what led you to writing the book Over My Dead Body.
Okay, well, great. I'm very excited to be here, Fred. Thank you so much for this opportunity. So I came from a background where I had numerous businesses and I had been an extreme skier. And in April of 2020, I was bit by a tick, although I didn't know that at the time because I grew up in Montana where the ticks were sticking out of your body. And these were more like spiders. And people ask, well, were you sick? And I said, well, it was my first trimester of pregnancy. I got bit the same month I got pregnant with my daughter. And so I had all of those symptoms, but they were explained by being pregnant. And so I didn't know. And the only thing that was very odd about it, there was no rash, there was no bullseye. However, 4 months later, I still had a hole in my leg. And I remember emailing a friend of mine and saying, what is up with the bites in Hilton Head? And because I still have a hole in my leg. And so my health started going downhill. And I went from doctor to doctor and just couldn't get answers. My primary physician was from Hawaii and he had no exposure to Lyme. And so it took 6.5 years to diagnose me. And I'm an extreme skier, so that tells you a little bit about my personality. So the doctor that finally said, I know exactly what you have. I didn't really know what Lyme was. I'd heard about it. I didn't really know what it was. And then he asked if I had had any children. And I had had my daughter. She was 5 years old at the time. And when he said she could have contracted it in utero, my heart sunk. And there was things that she was challenged with. However, I didn't know the source of that. And so I was highly motivated to get answers and get treatments. And so I kind of blasted myself into the treatments for the first year. She was not being treated. I thought, well, if I'm going to be doing experiments, I'm going to do them on myself first and make sure they work before I subject a 5-year-old to this. And the same month I was diagnosed was the same month that the NIH came out with a report saying latent chronic Lyme disease didn't exist. So, and the Connecticut Attorney General filed a lawsuit against that and had it thrown out. So we knew that that wasn't valid. However, there were so many different things that go wrong, it's really hard to nail down. It's very easily misdiagnosed. And I started with 12 IVs a week. I was still having to travel with my business, which is in the education business, and I was going to Washington. And I remember when I first started my treatments, I had about 104 fever for 6 months. And there was a time when I had been up on the hill and the bellman had to carry me to my room. I was so weak by the end of the day, and it was really hard. And the doctor had said, you know, that this is rough. And he said, are you sure you want to do this? And, you know, I had a 5-year-old. I was a single mom. So there was no choice in the matter for me. And he said, well, you're going to have days when you can't walk. You're going to have days when you can't talk. And there's going to be days when you just want to die. And he was 100% correct. So we went through treatments for 2.5 years, and I had an IV port put in because I had had so many IVs. And I contracted a blood infection from the IV port, and it had a 3% survival rate. And so I went downhill very fast, and they didn't want to take me off of the antibiotics because they knew I would die then. And it was truly a miracle that I'm alive. And the commonalities between the blood infection and the Lyme disease, I figured out one of the common threads was biofilm. That was a big part of what I figured out. And once we had that figured out, we came up with a protocol to dissolve the biofilm at the same time we were on antibiotics. And within 2 months, the Lyme disease was gone. It took longer for the blood infection to go away. It was very virulent, and it, you know, it's antibiotic resistant. They still have a lot of documentaries even on that particular blood infection, and it gave me answers. And so we got better. And the day that I knew, this is still really emotional for me to talk about, when my daughter was in the 2nd grade, and she came home from school one day and she said, Mom, today was the best Monday of my life. And I said, why, honey? And she said, because I'm not tired.
Yeah, I remember
And that,
when I read your book, that was a very powerful moment. So, and I applaud you again
yeah.
for the for where you went in your book, and I'm sure a lot of people listening can appreciate that. So, again, the second half of your book, you go very
Mhm.
detailed into things that you discovered, and that was a commonality, Mary Lynn, that I had found after I had before I published Love, Hope, Lyme, was that doctors only know so much. They can only spend so much time with you. A lot of times it's just textbook, if you will. So Lyme survivors have to take notes on tons of things, have to pay attention to tons of things, what they eat, not well, emotional, but also environmental things that
Mhm.
happened. Gluten, the
Yeah.
gluten, heavy metals, you mentioned. There's like a ton of things that you have to be aware of. So it's the whole concept of being a medical detective, like we talked about. Um, I want to talk about a couple of the things that you discovered, and I want to come back to also, how you got to the place where you were, where you uh, got to a good place, right? And then
Mhm.
you started offering. Well, why don't you address that right now? Kind of like bring us to that point, and why you wrote the book. And then let's get into detail because I know that listeners want to hear the various things that you discovered along the way.
Okay. Well, one of the things I discovered in 2007 was that I used an energetic device, and I had purchased it. It was about a $20,000 device because I didn't want to have my daughter on all of the supplements and medications that I was on. So I would treat her for 3 days, and I would treat myself for 3 days, and then I'd take a day off. And um, and so we we used to call it the IV room. Everybody was sitting around getting their IVs done. So I started testing other people on my device, and I found patterns. And that's really how I've come to find a lot of the things that I've figured out is the patterns that I see in the people that I work with. And one of the things that I found was everybody resonated for tuberculosis. And this was a big part of moving forward for both my daughter and me. And but it wasn't full-blown tuberculosis. And now I know that it's, or at least originally it was a bovine tuberculosis. So it didn't take off like a normal strand would. And I did streptomycin shots for 6 weeks, and the die-off was so great. I literally smelled like a rotting animal. It was so disgusting. However, we both got a lot better. So that was one of the things. And I thought, well, it had to have come from the immunization shots because I'd never had tuberculosis. And in 2019, the NIH released a report saying that humans could contract tuberculosis from deer. And more recently, they have identified it as a bovine tuberculosis. So that was something that I had discovered way before there was any kind of research about it. And the biofilm aspect of it was new, when I figured that part out. But both the Lyme disease, which I just started reading about, and the blood infection had a biofilm. And the doctor and I used to have all these talks because I'm a researcher. And so he said, when we figure it out, it's going to be something simple. And so figuring out that piece about the Lyme disease or about the biofilm and how to dissolve it was super important. And it's more well known now. However, it's just shocking to me that doctors don't know more about this and that they don't know more about detoxing and nutrition and those type of things. And what I've also discovered is that a lot of the Lyme literate doctors are people who have Lyme, and they started studying it because they have it themselves. However, most of them haven't cured themselves. And so, and I'm sure they're extremely busy, but I'm on a constant quest for finding new information. And a lot of that is coming from my patients. So we've been Lyme-free since 2009. My daughter and I both have. And then I wanted to make sure it was really gone. So every year I was doing a CD57 test to test my immune response. And I did that for years because I thought, well, if I'm going to put myself out there publicly, I want to make sure it's really gone. And my health has gotten so much better. I mean, I'm not professional athlete better because I'm in my 60s, but um, I'm I'm doing all kinds of crazy things. I did a bungee jump over Victoria Falls in Africa a couple of years ago. I was like I'm living life as full as I can, and I want other people to have that.
And I know everybody
They're
listening, they want to fully live life as well. I want to hit on a couple of the
Mhm.
topics that we were talking about before. So one of the challenges with Lyme disease is that it almost invariably comes with what's called co-infections.
Right.
And some people estimate that there's as many as 20, 30 different co-infections, and Bartonella, Babesia, Rocky
Mhm.
Mountain spotted fever, et cetera. Um, so I remember I was talking to a Lyme literate doctor who once said to me, uh, if it was only Borrelia, the traditional Lyme disease, we would have figured this out a long time ago. But the big
Mhm.
complexity is the co-infections. Some of them are parasitic, like Bartonella, and some of them are bacterium. Give us some of your insights, some of your thoughts about, the challenge of treating multiple comorbidities and how you could be treating something really well and then the other thing kind of takes over, and how to balance that.
Yeah. Well, it is very complex, and they're not all active at the same time. So my I have a different device now, and it's extremely detailed. I have never looked at how much it would cost to get traditional medical tests for all the things that I see in one test. It takes me hours to go through when I first take on a new patient. It's very extensive to look at everything, because I have to look at the effects that it's had on their body, what systems are weak, what they're allergic to, what co-infections they have, what some of it is not co-infections, it's just things, underlying infections that they may not even know they have. And then the Lyme mutates into different life forms. And I recently read a study that they have identified 46 different strands of DNA from Lyme disease, which is a crazy amount. And they're not all active at the same time. So these treatments of, let's just throw somebody on doxycycline for months, one size fits all does not work with this. And you have to know what's active and what life form it's in at that time. Like we scan people every 2 weeks so that we can identify that and switch courses, because Lyme is designed as a bioweapon. And so it's highly intelligent. And if you're doing one antibiotic and then it decides to hide in the biofilm, and then changes life form and comes out in a different form. And so you're constantly changing. It's not a one thing forever. It's okay, what do we do now? What do we do now? And you have to be strategic about it. So it makes it very, very complicated, and it doesn't mutate the same in everybody.
Explain for people who don't understand what biofilm is and why it's so important to healing and understanding this.
Okay, well, what I've learned is that I haven't found a chronic disease yet that doesn't have a biofilm. And parasites, for example, usually people know that parasites are very, very difficult to get rid of, and parasites create their own biofilm. So these pathogens create their own biofilm, and it's a fibrin fibrinogen material that the pathogen hides in. So what happens is the antibiotic comes into the body, it starts killing the pathogen, and the pathogen says, no, you're not, and it goes and hides in this biofilm that it created itself, so it knows where to go. And then it waits until the antibiotics are gone, when somebody stops taking them. And when the antibiotics are out of the body, then it comes back out. So when people say they're in remission, that's really when the pathogen is hiding. It's not really gone, it's just hiding. So if you don't get rid of the biofilm, you're not going to get rid of the disease. So
Yeah.
it's a critical piece, and it exists with cancer.
Yeah.
It exists with every chronic disease that I've researched. I haven't researched all of them.
Yeah. I'm just kind of curious on your thoughts. You mentioned
Mhm.
antibiotics, and you know, uh, it's obviously if you catch like a bullseye rash quickly, then if you take a couple weeks of doxycycline, the estimates are that you should be eradicating. That's acute Lyme. We're talking here about chronic Lyme, for the most part. What are some of your thoughts on continued use of antibiotics?
Well, what I've found is that your body, so let me back up a little bit. When I start working with somebody, the first thing I do is we do major detoxing, because there's only so many pathways to get rid of pathogens and toxins from your body. And most people that have had this for a very long time, those are all clogged up. Like your lymphatic system is clogged up, your liver, your kidneys, your skin. A lot of times people have sores on their skins. And and those are the pathways for getting rid of all these toxins. And it's not just the neurotoxins that Lyme releases on a daily basis. When you kill it, it's like it pukes out. I don't know how many of you have seen something die, but when something dies, it releases all of the fluids. Well, the Lyme does the same thing. And so that's what causes the Herxheimer's reaction. And I think most of your audience already knows what that is. So that's the pathogens puking out the toxins. Parasites also release neurotoxins. So you have this huge overload of toxin in the body. So we start there, and then it's really important to do that detox the whole time you're being treated, not only to get out the toxins from the medications, but the neurotoxins, and then you need a carrier to get the dead bodies out, which is really gross to think about, but you're killing pathogens in your body, and you have to get them out.
You have to get them out.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a process the entire time.
Before we talk about some of your final recommendations,
Mhm.
you also mentioned something called sticky blood or
Yeah.
hyperviscosity. That's something we haven't discussed before on the Love Hope Line podcast. Again, I'm talking today with Mary Lyn Hammer. What is that? And give the audience some insights into what that's all about.
Well, I that was one of the first things that we saw before I even knew I had Lyme disease. And I was doing an experiment with my doctor about what it like if you subject a body to high amounts of stress, and we all drove up to Sedona, Arizona for a weekend event where we were doing wet slide analysis. And so we went in the middle of rush hour, the most stressful time, to create a situation that your body had to cope with, and then see what effect that had on the blood. So I'm a complete nerd. So of course I was like, yeah, I'll do it. Sign me up. and, and so we looked at several other people's blood, and then we put my blood up there, and everybody was like, what is up with your blood? And it looked like a choo-choo train. So the cells were flattened more than normal, not as flat as sickle cell anemia, but flattened. And then they were stuck together. It looked like a choo-choo train. And it was like that immediately, where normally the blood doesn't start to coagulate until it comes in touch with oxygen. So there's usually just a very small amount until you put the second slide on, or, second piece of glass. And it stumped everybody. And so that was the first thing that we noticed. So my blood was very thick, and probably a lot of you have had IVs, or, when they're trying to get blood out of you, it's very difficult to get blood draws, and your blood looks very dark and it's thick, and that's the hyperviscosity, that it's really super thick blood. And that also causes things to happen in the body that cause inflammation. And so the hyperviscosity is also the reason why people are misdiagnosed quite often. And so I believe that it's biofilm forming inside the blood. And what I've seen the patterns show is that where the biofilm forms determines the symptoms. So if the biofilm is forming in your extremities, like when I was diagnosed, I hadn't felt my feet in 5 years. And it wasn't like they were completely numb. It was more like that horrible, painful feeling when your feet are waking up. And it'd been like that for so long that I didn't really think about it until I started healing. And I was on Capitol Hill one day, and we were walking to dinner afterwards, and I said, my feet hurt. And I went, oh my God, my feet hurt. And I'm jumping for joy. And all these people that were with me are going, what is wrong with you? And I was like, you don't understand. I haven't felt my feet in 5 years. But all of those things went away. And so, all of these things are tied together. And so I believe that the biofilm in the blood is what is causing this hyperviscosity. And so it's really super thick blood.
Wow.
And so the same, enzymes that break down the biofilm also thin the blood.
Mm.
And, one thing when I'm working with somebody, I have to work with the doctors if they're on blood thinners already, which a lot of people are. A lot of people are on heparin when they have uh, Lyme disease, that we have to back off of the heparin before we introduce the enzymes, because otherwise their blood gets way too thin.
Yeah.
And eventually they don't have to be on any of those things.
That is great. Wow, we covered a lot of things here, and there's so much more. It almost feels like, Mary Lynn, like we just hit the tip of the iceberg. So I want to thank you for being here again. There's a lot of topics here that we could further pursue, but I know that everybody who's listening um, has gone through this medical detective phase and probably will continue to go through it. Things emerge, right? Things come out of
Right.
the blue, stressor happens, and all of a sudden, certain things may be happening, maybe some neuro challenges that hadn't been there before, maybe something you haven't felt in like years. We all know, again, we're doing today's interview in May of 2025, and some stressor may happen. Something
Right.
people say get
Right.
hit by a car, or a certain type of death in the family, or something happened to a child or something, and all of a
Yeah.
sudden, these stealth bacteria that are deep inside your body may find a way to emerge. Um, is there any final thoughts? Again, we hit like the tip of the iceberg on a lot of these things, but is there anything else that you want to make sure you get across before we wind down today's show?
For sure. I want to stress that, there are products out there that you can buy to dissolve the biofilm. It is a critical piece. However, I want you to take into consideration that anything can come out of there. So it's very, very important to work with somebody who knows what they're doing, because, like, say if you've had blood infection before, you had sepsis before, you have to be ready to go on that antibiotic immediately if that comes out. Anything can come out. It's not just the Lyme disease that comes out, it's everything. I just want to say there, don't just wing this and do it on your own. Do a lot of research, look into your history, and make sure that you have everything ready in case something starts going sideways,
No, that's a
because
great
it
bit
can
of
be very
advice.
dangerous.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's there's so much complexity to it. Again, when you bring in the co-infections and the history and things like you talked about, you went 6.5 years before you were properly diagnosed. And there's so much damage that the bacteria and the parasites can do. And like everybody knows that, the Borrelia, it's a very stealthy operating, uh, bacteria. It digs into places that you don't know it's there. And then,
Right.
at some point it comes out. So I just want to applaud you again for the book, for your
Thank you.
advocacy, for the work that you're doing, your bravery and your courage. And I want to thank you for being on today's Love Hope Line podcast. In the notes, we'll post the link to the books and other places that people can find you. So once again, I'm Mary Lynn. I want to thank you for being on today's Love Hope Line podcast.
Thank you very much.